So I'd like to welcome everyone to the last session of our webinar series, which we are holding with internationally well-known scholars and experts. So today we are hosting Professor Noam Chomsky, and we're going to have a lecture from him on how to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I'm really happy to be here, and it's an honor to have Professor Noam Chomsky with us. The session will be 40 minutes. And after his presentation, it's going to be a short presentation. We are going to have the Q&A session. So I think we can start if we are all set.
Well, do you want to get started with me talking about the topic, or should we just move into discussion, which is typically more interesting? I'm happy either way. So if you would like to point to things that you think we should talk about, be happy to pursue it, or else I can talk about what's on my mind. The former is more useful.
Okay. So maybe you'd like to, if you'd like to say some things in your mind, like a short presentation. We also have some questions that were sent from the participants. So whenever you're done, we can just transition to the Q&A session. And our participants in here can also write their questions from the chat section. So we'll choose the questions from there and direct them to the Professor Chomsky. So feel free to write down your questions.
Well, I think what's on all of our minds is what is the way to try to achieve some limited, at least, form of justice and peace in the long-standing Israel-Palestine conflict. The latest intervention in this is what President Trump and his associates call the greatest deal of the century. It's worth, as soon as they announced it, was universally accepted that this is the framework in which we have to proceed. Can we make it work? Is it wrong in this respect? Much discussion and debate. It's worth bearing in mind that if anyone else had proposed this, it either would have been ignored or dismissed with ridicule. If it had come from China or France or any other country, no one would have paid the slightest attention because it's so obviously ridiculous. It's Prime Minister Netanyahu's plan handed over to Jared Kushner to read to the public. But when the United States produces it, it's law. That tells you something very important about international affairs. International affairs is very much like the mafia. There's a super don, the godfather, and everyone else is afraid of him. It doesn't work entirely like that, but it's very close. In this case, the godfather happens to be in Washington. Europe is, of course, a powerful force, but it's unwilling to risk angering the godfather. So when the godfather destroys the chances for peace in the Middle East with the Iran agreement, Europe doesn't like it, but they go along with it. When the US imposes sanctions, outrageous sanctions, Europe says, we don't like them, but we'll accept them. And it's the same with almost everything else, including the peace plan. So if we look at it, it's a plan for consummating what Israel has been working on for 50 years with constant US support, not annexing the West Bank. They don't want to do that. If they annex the West Bank, they get the population, and they don't want the population. If they have the population, that gives rise to what's called the demographic problem. Too many non-Jews in a Jewish state. We don't want that. So the plan from about 1970 has been to slowly, systematically take over the parts of the West Bank, formerly Gaza, formerly the Sinai, but they gave up on that, take over the parts of the West Bank that are of any value and interest to us. Includes the Jordan Valley, about a third of the West Bank, the major towns that are being developed, like Malda, Dumim, Ariel, mostly during the Clinton years, the passages to them, other areas that are useful and valuable, probably about 60% of the West Bank, but to avoid the population centers. So they don't want to take over Nablus. What they want to do is isolate it, make it unlivable, but maybe people will leave, but isolate it. As in any traditional neo-colony, there has to be something for the Palestinian elites. So if you go to the poorest country in Central Africa, you'll find a center where elites have fancy restaurants, lovely hotels, theaters, and so on. That's Ramallah. So we'll leave Ramallah for the Palestinian elites to enjoy themselves. The rest of the country will divide into literally hundreds of isolated cantons where poor villages are separated from their olive groves, their pasturing fields, and so on, have to pass through checkpoints where they may be allowed through, maybe not. Meanwhile, settlers rampage and do what they like. And maybe they'll all leave sooner or later, but we'll take over pretty much what we want. Currently, there is a government plan to annex the regions that they've integrated into Greater Israel. There's opposition to that. The opposition is coming from the settlers because they want everything. They are afraid that if they accept the annexation plan, that will leave something to the Palestinians, which they hope ultimately to take over. So there is opposition to the annexation, not from the US administration, which happy to give them anything they want, not from Israel proper. That's the plan they've been working on for years. But there's some opposition and might not take place. Well, is there anything that can be done about this? In principle, there's a lot. Europe, for example, could take significant action. It could determine to simply boycott everything that comes from the occupied territories flatly. They have some talk about that, but they're not implementing it. Now, this could lead to a confrontation, but it could be very effective. What about the United States? What happens in the long term there depends on the United States overwhelmingly. Now, right now, it looks as though the United States is overwhelmingly in support of Israel, but that's misleading. Opinion in the United States has shifted significantly in recent years. It used to be the case that support for Israel, passionate support from Israel, came from the liberal sectors of American life. Democratic Party, liberal intellectuals, liberal forces generally. That's totally changed. Now support from Israel for Israel comes from the most reactionary sectors of American life. Ultranationalists, evangelical Christians who look forward to a war between Jews and Arabs in which that Armageddon in which everyone will be destroyed and the second coming arrives and they all go to heaven and so on. That's the main source of support. Liberal Americans have shifted. So polls among liberal Democrats show that there's more support for Palestinian rights than for Israel. This is particularly true among young people, including the young Jewish population, which is much of which is appalled by Israeli actions and is drifting away from not only support from Israel, but even from Judaism. Now, these tendencies could be used to develop a serious, authentic solidarity movement in the United States, which unfortunately has not existed, could develop, could influence U.S. policy. U.S. support for Israel is very fragile. It's actually in violation of U.S. law. Now, this is not well known in the United States. Nobody talks about it. But there is a law in the United States, Symington Law, which blocks any aid to countries that have developed nuclear weapons outside the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel, of course, has done it, but you'll notice that the United States does not recognize that Israel has nuclear weapons. Of course, they know it, but they don't recognize it. And there's a good reason for that. If they recognize that Israel has nuclear weapons, U.S. law comes into force, and they have to ban U.S. military and economic aid to Israel. So the best idea is to keep it quiet, hoping that the media and the information system don't talk about it. But a solidarity movement could bring that into the open. There are other laws in the United States. It's called the Leahy Law, Senator Patrick Leahy, which bans military aid to any military units that are engaged in systematic human rights violations. The Israeli army is constantly engaged in those. And a solidarity movement could bring this into public attention. There are large parts of the country who are not interested at all in Israel-Palestine, which don't like to see foreign aid go in violation of U.S. law. It would, I think, be possible to develop a movement to try to ban U.S. military aid and economic aid to Israel. We fought over bitterly, but it could open doors, could open ways to lead to what might be a significant change in U.S. policy and a shift in the support for Israel, isolated to the most extremely reactionary sections and evangelical Christians who can't be reached on this issue. They have another agenda that has nothing to do with Israel. Now, those are all possibilities, I think, which can be exploited both in Europe and here. Of course, it'll take a lot of popular activism and engagement to bring them into reality. But as far as I can see, that's about the only serious hope for Palestinian rights or for anything like a just settlement of this dispute. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for this talk and providing us with a new perspective. And now we can transition to the Q&A session, if it's okay.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so after the Trump plan, U.S. lost its role as an honest broker. Due to this fact, did the two-state solution that UN has been offering since 1948 collapse? The two-state solution. So can we say that, according to things that you've said, that you mentioned, can we say that it's collapsed? I mean, it's not gonna work anymore. What would be the
two-state proposal?
Exactly.
Can that work? Well, let's take a look at its history, which in the United States is totally suppressed and very little known in Europe. The doctrinal system is very rigid on these issues, but there is a history. Now, the two-state settlement reached the United Nations Security Council in January 1976. There was a resolution brought with the support of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, calling for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border with, I'm quoting it now, with guarantees for the right of the two, Israel and Palestine, to live, to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. That was the resolution. Israel violently opposed it. The Israeli Prime Minister Rabin, said there will never be a Palestinian state. The United States vetoed it. The PLO gave it tacit support. It condemned the tyranny of the veto. After that, there was another similar resolution in 1980. The United States vetoed it. After that, the issue shifted to the General Assembly, UN General Assembly, Security Council, blocked by US veto. The Assembly almost every year passed some fairly strong resolution, pretty similar, adopted almost unanimously. The US and Israel were opposed, occasionally some US dependency, but basically unanimous. Well, that's the international record. Is it still viable? I think so. If the United States changed its position and came out in support of it, Israel would be compelled to obey. When the United States lays down the law, Israel can do nothing. In fact, every US president prior to President Obama had made demands on Israel that it didn't like, but it was forced to accept. And if this demand came, it would also be forced to accept it. In the 1970s, Israel made a fateful decision to choose expansion over security. They could have had security, full peace treaty with the major Arab states, the PLO, along the lines of the 1976 resolution. But they made a decision to prefer to abandon security in favor of expansion. That's what we've seen for the last 50 years. That means that they're totally dependent on the United States. They've abandoned any support from any meaningful support from anywhere else. So when the US lays down the orders, they have to obey. So that's a possibility. And if there was a change in US policy, it might actually happen.
Okay, so how about the one-state solution?
There is no one-state solution. That's a total illusion. It's, in fact, serves as a way to support Israel. There is no possibility that Israel would agree to terminate its existence, to go out of existence, and to become a Palestinian state. And furthermore, there is no support for that in the world, none, not in the African countries, not in the third world, not in the global south, certainly not in Europe. Third world countries are very jealous of sovereignty. They don't want to see sovereignty overruled. It's dangerous for them. So this is a proposal with no support, no possibility of being realized. It's a way of avoiding the fact that the two realistic options are: one, a two-state settlement in accord with the international consensus, and two, the Greater Israel project that we see being implemented before our eyes. Now, I've always been in favor, all my life, back to the 1940s, of what's now called a one-state solution, of some sort of binational settlement for the former Palestine. I think we can move towards that. Up until 1975, it was in fact feasible. I was writing about it, but there was no interest in it. Not from the Arab states, not from the Palestinians, of course, not from Israel. So it died. 1975, things changed. Palestinian nationalism, for the first time, became a force on the international agenda. At that point, the options shifted to either two states or the Greater Israel Project, and that's where they remain. Talk about one state today is like saying, let's lay down our arms and have peace tomorrow. You know, that would be nice, but that's not a program, that's not a policy.
Okay. Can we also say that it has a connection with the demographical problems? Because I've heard that most of the people, most of the Palestinians in the West Bank actually do agree with the one-state solution, but the Israelis don't actually accept it because they see the people in the West Bank as like terrorists. So they're like
terrorists. It's not that they're terrorists, it's that they're people.
Yes.
They are people. If there were one state, the Palestinians would outnumber the Jews, which means Israel would disappear. It would become a Palestinian state. Of course, Israel's not going to accept that. Furthermore, no one in the world supports that. Not the European states, not the African states, not China, not Russia, no one. There is zero support for it. So saying I would like it is like saying I would like to have peace on earth. If you want to achieve your objectives, you have to become part of the real world. You can't live in a world of illusion. You can't say like a child, I would like to have this, therefore that's what I want. You have to look at what the real world is and see what can be achieved. And this could be a long-run goal, the way I described, but it's not an imminent, it's not a possibility for the near future.
Okay, thank you so much. Power of the Zionist lobby and its success is clear. How much do you think Jewish lobbies in the US affect the Israeli policy? And how does it actually affect it? We can say.
What actually happens is that if the United States government doesn't care that much, then organized sectors of the population can have a big impact. It includes the Jewish lobby, includes the Turkish lobby. So there is a Turkish American population. For years, they've been blocking recognition of formal recognition of Armenian genocide very effectively. They have enough pressure, so they block any talk about this. Other pressure groups, Greek Americans, evangelicals have a strong influence on policy, very strong influence, because they're a large part of the population, 25%. And they're the core of the Republican Party now, so they have a major influence. The same is true of Jewish groups. They pour a lot of money into campaign funding for a long time, not less now than before. They dominated the media and journals of opinion. That's declined, but they've had a major effect. On the other hand, when the US wants something, they run into the corner and disappear many times. So, for example, they know much better than to confront US power. As I said, if you want, I can go through the record, but it's true of every president except Barack Obama. He's the first one who never made a demand on Israel. But before that, so take his predecessor, George W. Bush. Israel's economy relies very heavily on military production and military export. There's a huge market that they want to break into with high-tech weapons, China. China would like to have them. Israel would love to send high-tech weapons to China. It's continually made efforts to do so. It's been continually slammed down by the United States. Most recently, George W. Bush, who not only demanded that they stop it, but went out of his way to humiliate Israel. He demanded a formal apology for having made this effort. He blocked entry of high Israeli military officials did to the United States. And they, of course, backed down. And there's case after case like that. If the U.S. government strongly, and the lobby didn't make a word, say a word, not a word, because this is a strong position, they're not going to confront the U.S. power. So it's not 100% correct, but it's overwhelmingly the case.
Okay, thank you so much. How do you think that the Israeli media and their intense Zionist propaganda affect the public opinion towards the Israeli-Palestinian issue?
For the Israeli public or for the world?
For the world, yeah. Yeah, in the sense of the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts.
Well, it affects the world insofar as other countries pick it up and amplify it. People in the United States don't read the Israeli media. I mean, I do, but not very many people do. So whatever appears in the Israeli media reaches the United States, France, England, and so on, through their own information systems. If the New York Times picks up Israeli propaganda and distributes it, then it reaches Americans. And I'm sure it's the same in Turkey. You don't read the Israeli press, but if it does have an influence on international media, which then present it to the wrong publics. In Israel itself, it's quite striking what's happened. You go back to the 1970s, Israel was a leading social democratic country, was very respected throughout the world. Young Europeans, leftist, progressive young Europeans would go to Israel to enjoy living in a kibbutz, seeing the social democratic country and so on, considered a model for progressives around the world. That has totally changed. Israel is now regarded with contempt and dislike, result of the occupation and the brutal efforts to repress Palestinians. That's happened in the United States too. Until, I can just tell you my personal experience. I've been giving talks on this topic and writing about it publicly for 50 years. I literally used to have police protection if I gave a talk at a university on Israel-Palestine, even my own university. There had to be a contingent of police there to prevent violence. Totally changed. By now there are huge crowds, you can barely get a critical question. The turning point came actually with the Israeli attacks on Gaza. You go back to Cast Lead, 2006, there was a strong negative reaction here. And it changed opinion enormously, especially among young people. And then it just continued. Israeli propaganda has much less influence than it had in the past. The media still keep to it pretty much, and elite opinion pretty much does. But among the general public, there's a shift.
Okay, so you're saying that there is this positive change in the public opinion towards the conflict. So would this is the path which is leading us to the solution for this conflict?
Well, the shift in public opinion has not yet led to a shift in policy. It's not enough for people to want something. Doesn't matter. That has no effect on policy. The government disregards what people want. If it's not interested in them, it's serving other interests. But if public opinion gets organized and effective, then it can have an effect. In fact, you're seeing it right now in the streets of the United States. That's organized public opinion, which doesn't want to tolerate anymore what they've been tolerating for years. The murder of George Floyd is not that unusual. Things like that have happened for a long time. But the public has mostly been kind of quiet. In fact, it's very interesting to look closely. The closest analog to what's happening today in the United States is 1992. Don't know if you know about it, but a black man, Rodney King, was practically beaten to death by Los Angeles police. He went to trial. They went to trial and they were acquitted. That led to a huge uprising in Los Angeles. It went on for over a week. 60 people were killed. The federal troops were called out to try to suppress it. There wasn't much of a reaction in the rest of the country. It's very different from what happened now. Now there's been an enormous reaction all over the country. Chiefs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military officers in the country, have come out supporting the protesters. That's utterly without precedent. And it's the result of organized activist efforts to bring about a change in public opinion, which has happened, not over the entire country by any means, but over significant parts of it. That's how things change. It's not enough to want it. You have to do something about it.
Okay, so this is what actually activism is like, right? Can we call it as activism? And can we say that BDS and such movements like Jewish Voice for Peace are organized, effective movements?
The idea of boycott and divestment, there aren't any sanctions. A boycott and divestment was actually initiated in 1997 by an Israeli group. Uri Avneri, a very fine journalist, militant peace activist, he and his group, Gush Shalom Peace Group, initiated a boycott divestment program aimed at the occupied territories. It was pretty successful. It's picked up pretty broadly. Even the Presbyterian Church, one of the main churches in the country, supports boycott and divestment for the occupied territories. They go on to call for divestment from U.S. corporations who are involved in any way in the occupied territories. That's a very viable proposal. It could lead to real consequences. Then came the BDS movement, initiated by Omar Barghouti in Palestine, picked up all over. It's different. It does mention the occupied territories, but it insists on policies which are self-destructive. It insists on, say, academic boycotts of Israel. As soon as you call them, you can make an argument for it. But if you're an activist who thinks about consequences, you ask, what's going to happen if I call for an academic boycott on Israel? Perfectly obvious. There'll be a huge backlash. You'll be accused of total hypocrisy with some justice. Why don't you have a boycott on Harvard and MIT and Chicago? They're engaged in much worse policies. And what happens is the discussion shifts away from Palestinian rights to issues of academic freedom, hypocrisy, and so on. A net loss for Palestinians. Same with the second of the BDS proposals. They have three. One is occupied territories. One is boycott of Israel until it ends all repression, which it simply turns the topic to other issues and leads to charges of hypocrisy, forget the Palestinians. The third is an insistence on return of Palestinians, okay? That's a loser. There is never going to be return of all the refugees. Everyone knows it. The PLO knows it. They knew it in the 1950s when they were talking about symbolic return, recognition of the right of return, but not fully implementing it. But the BDS movement insists on implementing it. It's like calling for one state. It's a loser. It's not going to happen. Nobody supports it. All it does is open charges of anti-Semitism, opens laws which to ban the BDS movement, so then they go to fight the laws. Everybody forgets the Palestinians. Okay, the BDS movement is well-intentioned. It's my friends, you know, I like them, I argue with them, but the tactics are designed to be suicidal. And that's exactly what we've seen. What we need is a popular movement which will pay attention to the consequences of what you do, which will be committed to developing tactics which will benefit the victims, not tactics that make me feel good, tactics that benefit the victims. And that would be essentially the kind that the Uri-Avneri movement started in 1997, that the church picked up, that many European countries have followed, focused on the occupation. There you have a very strong case, no deviation to other issues, enormous international support, plenty of public support. You can really achieve results. So I think if a movement, solidarity movement develops, which concentrates on that, picks up the kind of topics I mentioned, which the BDS movement ignores because they're not part of the official program. They keep to their official program. They don't do the kinds of things that could be effective. But if a movement develops that does carry out effective tactics, I think it could have an impact.
Okay, thank you so much. It was really inspirational. Okay, I think we're running out of time, so I'd like to ask this question. This is the question that we were asking to all the speakers that we're hosting. All participants here are working on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have journalists in here and a group of researchers, young academics, and volunteers from our Jerusalem research platform. What advice would you give to those who are considering to focus their research on the conflict, on the Israeli-Palestinian issue? We'd like to hear your advices.
I didn't understand the question.
Okay, so what would be your advices to the young academics who like to
young academics?
Yeah.
My advice is to move to become an activist who tries to change things, but to understand some principles of activism. There's one essential principle that has to be kept in mind. There's a distinction between what are sometimes called do-good tactics and feel-good tactics. You can take tactics that make you feel good. Say, look what I'm doing. Isn't it wonderful? I feel real good about it. There are other kind of tactics that help the victims. That's much harder. The feel-good tactics are easy, but pointless. They divert attention to what has to be done. The do-good tactics are hard, but they're what matter. That's true in Israel-Palestine. It's true in everywhere else. Now let's take the protests in the United States right now. If you take a close look, you'll notice that Black organizers and Black activists are trying to direct the protests to peaceful, nonviolent protest. That means they're opposing a lot of young white activists who are angry and want to break windows and shout at the police and so on. That's the difference between do-good and feel-good tactics. It may make you feel good to break a window and to scream at the police, but that increases the strength of the reactionary forces that are supporting racism. So if you want to support the right wing, do it straight out. Don't pretend you're anti-racist or anti-fascist. You're not. what the black organizers are doing is saying, we want progress for ourselves. We don't care if you feel good. We want things to be better for ourselves. And there's overwhelming evidence that peaceful protests lead to progress, violent protests lead to regression. It's overwhelmingly been true. The reasons are pretty obvious. Violent protests are much easier. It's much easier to break a window than to engage in peaceful protests. But that distinction has to be kept in mind on every issue. It's hard, but important. It's true on Israel-Palestine, as we were just discussing. It's true on this issue. It's true on every other issue. You have to ask, what are the consequences of my action going to be? In particular, what are the consequences for the victims? Not how do I feel about it?
You mentioned something really important, actually. It reminded me a quote that you were saying in your On Palestine book. You were saying that we have to consider what Palestinians actually want instead of what we actually want. So this is something that we don't really think about, because everyone is trying to find its own solution instead of asking to Palestinians themselves, instead of looking to the victims. So there are so many questions. I don't think that we will be able to have them, sadly. But maybe you'd like to say something on this, like why is it so important to think about the victims and why we have to consider what they actually want in the path which is leading us to the solution?
Well, what Palestinians want, and they have every right to want it, is a solution for all of Palestine in which there's justice and equality for everyone, no discrimination, cooperation, mutual aid, and so on. And that's not an impossibility, but it can only come in stages. It's not going to come by just snapping your fingers. Things don't happen that way. It has to come in stages that can be achieved. Now, there is one stage that can be achieved. Since 1975, when Palestinian nationalism became a major issue, about the only thing that can be achieved in the short term is some viable two-state settlement. It's a terrible settlement. I think it's awful, but it's the one that can be achieved. And it can be the basis for moving on. If the cycle of violence, hatred, anger declines, normal relations among human beings will overcome them. In fact, that's happened every time there were periods of peace. People started, Israeli Jews would cross into the occupied territories for commerce or see friends or something. Peaceful relations among people just begin to develop. And sooner or later, everyone will realize that it makes absolutely no sense to draw a line through the former Palestine and say, we don't talk to each other. That's harmful to everybody. So I think the borders will slowly erode, and they will lead to a possibility of moving on perhaps to a binational federation of two states, which can then erode still further. We've seen plenty of examples of that in the past. Furthermore, we should not worship the imperial borders. The borders between, say, Israel and Lebanon were imposed by imperial violence, French and British violence. No reason to worship that. I'll tell you a personal incident. Back in the early 1950s, I was living for a while on a kibbutz in Israel, and I was young then, your age. I went hitchhiking in the north, and while I was one evening, I was hitchhiking and just hiking in the north. A Jeep came in a road behind me. A guy got out of it and yelled at me. He said, "Come back," in Hebrew. You'd come back, you're in the wrong country. I had wandered into Lebanon because there was no border. The border is totally artificial. Of course, now it's an armed camp, but that's as a result of what's happened in the recent years. And it can erode. I think in time it can be recognized that it makes no sense to divide the Galilee into two different areas. They're one unit. That border can erode. And it's in that context that there might be some hope for real significant return of refugees. So if you're interested in return of refugees, I think that's the long-term hope that you should look for. But you can't get these things just by saying, I want them, so let's have them. You have to ask, how can I move step by step towards achieving my objectives? And what are the tactics that will lead to it? Now, that's the way to get some results on any issue, and in particular on this one.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Would you accept a few more questions, or should we end the session in here?
I'm afraid I'll have to leave. I have another interview coming up.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for giving your precious time for us and answering our questions. We really appreciate that you agreed to come here for this lecture. I hope you all enjoyed the program and this webinar series. I also would like to thank to you on behalf of my team and also the audience. So it was a great pleasure to have you in here, and we really hope to have you for another lecture maybe next time.
I hope so. It's a pleasure to be with you. Sorry I have to leave.
Thank you all for participating.